What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, live and direct from Balenciaga. And you're tuned into season 2, episode 16 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
All right, everybody. So before we get into this week's Shoot This Shit, we need to shout out our new patrons. So thank you to Brayley Isono, Ya Oforiwa, Groucho Suave, and Alexander Skladanowski for becoming patrons and helping us to pay our laid-back ass producer. Thank you as always.
Thank you. That sounds like a regular United Nations. We got a little some of everything. Thank y'all. But anyway, so basically what we want to shoot the shit about today, let me start with the story. So friend of the show, Erica Kanes, Ricky Ryan, shamed me for wanting to get some Girl Scout cookies. So I was like, oh shit, is it Girl Scout season? Let me go grab my Thin Mints, my Samoas, basically just those two. And she gonna say, don't you be buying them
Caramel Delights are not Samoas anymore.
Well, anyway, Samoas. And so she was like, don't go buy them war cookies. And I was like, and because, the Girl Scouts got a partnership with Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. And so, my initial response was, if we're going to not consume anything that is related to war, imperialism, capitalism, we just go starve. So let me go and grab these cookies. But of course, the more I thought about it, I was like, let me not support intersectional imperialism. Let me not eat these motherfucking war cookies. But then that raises the question, number one, as Two Black framed it, is there any ethical consumption under capitalism? And number two, is withholding your few dollars a boycott? We like to call it a boycott, but if it's not organized, is it really a boycott? And also, like, what is our responsibility to like make these decisions? So weigh in, sister and brother.
I mean, I think it's complicated because okay, so the follow-up question that you asked, like, obviously making an individual decision not to participate in anything is not enough, right? And if we were to say anything different, then how could we continue to say that, how can we continue to advocate for people that we need to join an organization? Like, obviously it is important to have some sort of organized campaign for any of these things to mean anything. In terms of the question about ethical consumption under capitalism, I mean, the thing is, we're all always implicated, right? There's no, I mean, and not even just consumption. By virtue of working, by virtue of living, being, and existing, we are implicated in these structures. But, however, I still do think it is important for us to not, I mean, because the way that we exist under capitalism is so totalizing, so encompassing. I don't think we should ever give up on at least knowing, signaling, acknowledging what the different ways that it has become so sort of ingrained and mundane in our everyday experiences, right? I don't necessarily think, obviously I don't think Erica was wrong for pointing it out. I think, we make choices about whether or not we want to eat the cookies, or whether or not we want to buy the bags, or whether or not we want to take the trips. But I think it's important to always be thinking about those things. Like, I don't necessarily know that I have the answer to that. I don't think we should ever stop pointing it out. And I do think that organized boycotts or protests against these things are important. But, again, that initial question about the sort of individual abstention doesn't necessarily do what we think it does. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer the question, is there ethical consumption under capitalism? I would say no, just to be honest. I don't think that. I mean,
vegans.
Say what?
Not even vegans.
Definitely not. But I don't know. That doesn't mean that you don't boycott or you don't watch boycott campaigns. I just think we need to. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. Like, we need to stop over promising or overselling what we're actually doing. So by, you know, putting on pressure on the campaign. It could be, there's a lot of different reasons why people can boycott, and that there's a long history of boycotts, some more effective than others. I mean, you know, we talk about apartheid in the interview, and we know, like, you know, boycotting or divesting is its own form of boycotting too, like, you know, in regards to apartheid South Africa. Like, it has some relationships there. So it's like, if you think about it in that sense, like, you're trying to target a particular type of system, and you're trying to put pressure on that. And even you have something when you're talking about with, you know, there's another debate on that, but as far as a so-called apartheid in Israel and Palestine as well, and there's the BDS movement, those type of things I think can be effective but all boycotts are not created equal. So you have stuff over here sometimes that can get really liberal, and it's just about they don't support black people in this really abstract sense. And I don't even know if that's even co-opted, because it's so weak to start with that there's nothing to really co-opt. So it's just like, they don't support black dollars, so we're not going to support Christmas, and somehow that's going to spread the pain, and that's going to make the police stop killing us. Like, these are just poorly linked arguments that don't really work. So I don't really think, you know, I think boycotts can be effective because you're trying to point out contradictions, but the contradictions still are showing that you are part of the thing. You're actually trying to show people how much more you are a part of it, but we just don't need to sell it that simply by you not ordering Amazon, or you canceling your Amazon Prime, that you're going to really be able to hurt Amazon. And then lastly, I remember when Erica was actually on Black Myths, it was actually a really funny moment. One of my co-hosts, Shell, I think Anya was talking about chocolate in Africa and how obviously that's made by slave labor and something. And that part's not funny. But then at the same time, she's literally talking about this. Shell was eating a chocolate bar. I think as somebody eats a chocolate bar, I think it's
first off, I'm supporting black business.
Wow.
It was just like a terrible moment. and then like, but then we ended up having a longer conversation about how Shell putting down that chocolate bar does not end the slavery in Africa. And a lot of times people think by simply, I'm not going to eat this, and then I've done my job. Or I'm not going to buy this, and then I've done my job. And we're like, you have to join. I think they said
one person not eating one chocolate bar is just not going to do shit. It's not going to do shit. You're not helping those kids. Eat the chocolate bar if you need to. The most important decision you can make, the most important contribution you can make as an individual is to join an organization that's fighting to destroy capitalism.
And I think boycotting sometimes, depending on how it's framed, can just be an easy escape to not really have to engage in the struggle. I just don't buy that anymore. You know, I don't eat that or whatever. I think that's just a little too, it can be escapist.
Yeah, because you know, when I had to give up my Sabra hummus, I was distraught when I realized that I had to give that shit up.
Well, I think so, and it's also like, I think we need to distinguish between a boycott and withholding your own individual dollars. You not buying Sabra is not, you know, or, you know, if it's an organized campaign and you're participating, that's one thing, right? But you not buying a candy bar or something is not a boycott in and of itself. The other thing that I'm thinking about is like, so I think that there are sort of like pragmatic or event-oriented boycotts that might be effective. So for example, Kellogg, when the Kellogg workers were on strike and not buying Pop-Tarts or, you know, with other Kellogg brands, I think that is because it's concentrated and it's sort of event or it was focused on the strike, right? To really show like, we're not fucking with y'all till you treat your workers right. But when it's a sort of long, protracted, abstract sort of, or even individualized withholding, then it's kind of like, what is this point? Like I'll get a text or a message every once in a while, like on Tuesday, October 12th, withhold your black dollars, don't shop at Target. But it's like, you know, so it's like, first of all, like who picked this random date? And like who's organizing this? And it doesn't have any objectives. And that's the other thing. What are the objectives?
Exactly.
And what is the goal? Like, is it time bounded? Are there strategies that are being implemented? Are there definable objectives? To me, that's when these types of sort of boycotts are most useful. But it's interesting when you mention BDS, which is boycott, divest, sanctions, I am against sanctions, period. I don't care who it is. And that's another question too, because even if it's sanctions against an apartheid state, sanctions are sanctions. And if we believe our analysis about sanctions, we know that it affects the people who are already most oppressed, that is to say the Palestinian people, right? Because of the intertwinement of the Palestinian and Israeli economies, because of the nature of work there, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's something else that needs to be rethought. I'm not extremely conversant on BDS, but like sanctions are sanctions, even if they're used against our enemies, right? And so I think that that's something else to think about.
I mean, I'm thinking out loud on this one. I don't have all the facts on this one, but I'm saying sometimes the people I know, even during the anti-apartheid movement, they would use the argument that we'll use about sanctions, about boycotts. They'll say that and I hear this in general about boycotts sometimes, like by boycotting, you're actually hurting the workers that are on the ground. And I think this argument is typically BS, but I'm saying like they do use that argument. So I'm interested in how like that relates to sanctions. I don't think they're the same thing.
Of war.
No, again, I'm not saying they're the same thing, but I'm just curious of how people try to tie those things together, like that a boycott and a sanction is almost the same, because ultimately they'll use a similar argument that we use with sanctions, that you're hurting the people at the quote unquote bottom, and for the audience, how can we distinguish that?
Boycotts are from below. Boycotts are for organized by people. Typically, sanctions come from the state. Sanctions are literally the state freezing assets, refusing to do business, preventing travel, those sorts of things. So sanctions are sort of top down, and they are driven by the state. And so when folks call for sanctions, it's putting demands on like the USA, because there was even calls for sanctions for during sort of the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s. Against apartheid in South Africa, but boycotts are people driven. So I would say, to me, that's the distinction that I would make. And successful boycotts require massive amounts of organizing. They require coordination across sectors often. The sanctions don't require none of that shit, because it's the state, and we're gonna do it or we not. And it's usually arbitrary, and it's usually against people who they deem enemies, often socialists, generally people of color, and then now Russia.
So agreed. The thing that I was thinking about, which is a slightly different direction, but still related to this conversation, is even how maybe you and I specifically, Sharice, as academics, think about our role and responsibility when it comes to certain fellowships and who they're funded by and where that money comes from and what is it, or even scholarships, right? Because this is something that I think comes up, even the sort of more benign looking scholarships at universities that a lot of times students of color will receive come from money that was accumulated by dubious means, to say the least. And there's always these conversations about, okay, well, who are you taking money from? What does that mean? Who are you responsible to? Who are you accountable to? And so even those types of questions, and I think people argue their way out of and around those things, particularly when it comes to scholarships, because typically, that money has been amassed and accumulated.
I don't work for the CIA. I don't work for the CIA.
Money. It's our fucking money. If they accumulated that wealth by stealing our shit, so it's our money, which is different than me spending my money on something, right? Run us this fucking dough. The Mellons, McNairs, Rockefellers, whoever. It's like, bitch, you stole that shit anyway, so run it.
It's true. But then the question becomes, when you get money from the State Department or the Ford Foundation or the Mellon.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. I mean, I'm not trying to call anybody out directly, but this has been a thing I've seen online where it's just like, we talked about this off camera, but like how, you'll take money from something that's related to the CIA, and then you'll try to say, well, I'm not an asset, or I'm not an agent, or I'm not a part of it. And I think it could get confused. Like, you might have genuinely taken the money with not knowing the connections or the strings attached. But I think that this is why the consumption part, I think, is on my nerves, because it individualizes the problem. Whether you know it or not, you're still perpetuating what they want. So if they gave money for you to, do some African studies, as we know, in somewhere in one of the countries that post the colonial era, quote unquote, for neocolonialism, they gave you money for that. Like, that's on purpose. They're trying to engender a particular politic. Now, maybe you flip it, but But I think people overdo that narrative too, that we're gonna take it and flip it like on some spook to set beside the door shit, and that rarely ever happens. And it's another way to just individualize the thing, like you're this revolutionary who, when you get the money, I'm gonna do something different. But they've been giving us money for a long time, and that just doesn't seem to happen very often. So maybe that just doesn't work, you know? Like, or if it does, we need to organize something collectively. That's not something you individually can do.
Well, I think that what one can do, part of taking the money is taking the money. Part of what I try to think about is what are the stipulations? Because sometimes they really just are giving you this shit to assuage their white guilt. And because it's a tax write-off. And some people are like, if it's the State Department, for example, we got to see your shit. You have to be studying a very particular narrow topic in particular areas. And so there's more and less control and more and less intervention that I think we can be mindful of. And so that's why you might take a random 2-year Mellon grant versus a State Department type of government.
Yeah, there's levels. There's levels to the shit.
Affiliated. Yeah.
But even with the levels, right? Even when they don't require anything, but what we also know is that whatever we produce that comes out of, so like, and I think it depends. But as an anthropologist, this is something that I struggle with a lot, because one of the things that I had to decide, even when I was in the field, when I was having, funds to write up shit, is that I had to make a concerted effort to not write about certain things or certain people because of ongoing struggles, right? And because even though at the time nobody was directly asking me to turn in my shit, what I know is that whatever ends up getting published gets read by whoever the fuck gets read about it, including people who are not interested in the liberatory politics of whatever the project is, right? And it, excuse me, it can and most often does get used inadvertently against it. So I think even like, I don't know, I think we're having to ask all these questions all the time about everything that we engage in, because nothing is purely innocent, nothing is without consequence, nothing happens in a vacuum. And so even all the good shit that we think that we're doing, even these conversations that we have on the podcast, right? Like they're a public record of how a sector of the population is thinking about a thing, right? And it can absolutely be used against us in some kind of way, right? And that is the horror and the beauty of capitalism, where they figure out how to use even the shit that we do for ourselves against us, right? And so that's just that's a part of the world that we're living. That's how we're existing, right?
Yeah, that's how they say the game is to be sold, not to be told. I feel like we, again, in terms of like, I think that to your point, Layla, like when you do your real research and then you write up a version of that protects your subject to the best of your ability, right? On the podcast, we ain't giving away no floor plans. Like we not saying the quiet part out loud. We just talking shit. We giving people places to look. You know what I'm saying? And so you have to look askance at the people who really are talking in real time, giving revolutionary blueprints, because it's like you're snitching. One, that's dry snitching, and two, like who is paying you to do that? Like, you know what I mean? And so, but it's interesting, right? That sense of discernment comes from a politic. It comes from being in organizations. It comes from being in conversation or in study with other radicals or revolutionary folks. It comes with a particular commitment to not snitching, to, to protecting what is, but to also be sort of invested in political education. And so in and of it, and I think that goes back to sort of the starting point of this conversation is like, if what you're doing is rooted in a particular organization or a political or politics, it might be more meaningful than if it's just like, an arbitrary, willy-nilly, like protect your Black dollar, whatever, and whatever. I guess they got politics. I don't fucking know, but like, if it be part of something bigger than yourself, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sentiment, even though I go in on those the Black dollar types, because there is no such thing as that, just for the record. But but even though I go in on that, like I think the sentiment of wanting to do something, I think that is something that people are looking for, and sometimes boycotts seem very practical on their face, even if you look under it and it's not. Like on its face, It's like, okay, I can do this, and then this can be the outcome. Like, it's presented in a way that makes sense, like on the surface, and then often it goes awry because all those politics aren't there, right? And it just goes somewhere else, But I mean, again, on the ethical consumption part, I just think when there's nothing ethical about. We were talking last week about there's no benign colony. So if you're in a colony, then how can you have an ethical consumption in a colony? Like, it doesn't actually even make sense. Like, you're in a colony, so anything from there is always going to be tainted and full of blood money. Now, I just don't think that inherently means everything is simply a divestment. Like, some things are, some things aren't. Some things you have to negotiate with. And that's why the struggle becomes dialectical. It's not always a simple, like, I'm not going to do it. Because we talk about consumption, but like we're saying, anything, like, if we get called in to do a keynote somewhere, I'm sure somewhere the diversity department's money is funded by some bullshit that we probably don't agree with. Even if we go there and talk it down, like, it's funded by that. So should we turn down all keynotes? Should we turn down all... everything we get to do? Should we not publish books? Like, so I'm not saying you don't do anything, because I'm saying all of it, ultimately, if you trace the money, is going to be funded by that. So it's never going to just be like, there's this one pure thing. But when you talk about ethical consumption, then it becomes a lot of times this hunt for the purity, for the pure thing that you can do, that you feel that you're not guilty, you're not connected to any kind of violence or struggle, and you'll never find that. And I think a lot of times the younger generation gets inundated with that, okay, this is bad, this support, they work for ICE, or, this is connected to Israel. But then it's like, there's really nothing you can go to that's not going to be connected to that on some level. So sometimes we have to figure out ways to navigate it that is not simply a boycott or a divestment, because if that's the case, then you're going to have to sit out everything. And if you're going to sit out everything, then that needs to be just an organized strike, right? Like, we're just going to strike. And I think strike is a much further left version of boycotting, when you actually shut down the production of things, not just the consumption of things.
Yeah, and I think that even the question should be less about whether or not one can consume ethically, but being mindful and being informed, right? No, like, because you can know, when you know things, you can make particular types of strategic decisions. Later on in our interview, the proverb was mentioned. Basically, when the snake is noticed, is no longer dangerous, right? And so when you notice and realize how all of these things are connected and that you can't really get out of it, you then at least can make informed decisions and different types of decisions without taking on this hero complex. Like, I buying Toms instead of Nikes, and so I get to lead a revolution. It don't work like that,
So long story short, you buying the cookies or no?
Fuck them kids.
Okay, so y'all, for this week's planting thoughts, I decided to take advantage of my current location. So because Germany has been getting on my last motherfucking nerves, and there has actually been a really bad storm that hit most of Europe that has actually killed some people, and power's been gone. I'm so glad I got out at the time that I did. So I am in Valencia at the moment, and the place where I'm staying has all of these, you can see it behind me, these yucca plants. So this is the Yucca gigantea, or the spineless yucca, which is native to Mexico and Central America. It's a pretty hardy plant. It can get up to about 40 feet tall in some places. There are about 6 of them on this balcony where I am. The one behind me is actually quite tall. It's taller than I am. But the thing that I will say about the yucca is not actually about it as a plant. I just think about it as a food for the most part. It is, yucca is in the same kind of family as cassava. It forms one of the staples of a lot of Latin American, Caribbean, African diets. I was first introduced to yucca as a food group, or not a group, but as a food when I went to Venezuela for the first time. And it gives me, it can be prepared in similar ways to plantains, although you don't eat it in its sweet form. But what I appreciate about the yucca is that it is plain and unassuming, but it is hearty and life-giving. So that is what we will think about this week as we think about the spineless yucca or the yucca gigantea for our planting thoughts. All right, you all. We have a very special guest today that I'm very excited to welcome to the show. Today we have Dr. Nyasha Mboti, who is the founder and pioneer of the new field of study known as apartheid studies. He's an associate professor at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa, where he heads the Department of Communication Science. Nyasha is the author of the 4-volume book entitled Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto, published by Africa World Press. In this book, Nyasha makes the case for establishing the overdue field of apartheid studies and outlines a theoretical framework based on the systematic study of apartheid as a paradigm. He argues that apartheid exists everywhere in the world. There is persistent oppression, since apartheid is the interface that allows oppression not only to persist, but to do so as part of daily life and without causing a crisis. Professor Mboti identifies apartheid studies as an interdisciplinary invitation to a new understanding of why things are the way they are in the world and what to do about it. The book launch of the first volume of Apartheid Studies and Manifesto is slated for March 2022, so stay tuned. And welcome, Nyasha.
Thanks so much, Leila and Dr. CBS, for the very kind introduction. And I hope that today I'm going to be able to at least give your viewers and your listeners an introduction to what apartheid studies is all about. And hopefully we can have a generative engagement from this and afterwards.
Let me just start with a very basic question, but like, what is apartheid? And is every form of racial segregation an apartheid system?
Right. Thank you for that, Dr. CBS. And it's a very pointed question. What I would like to actually say in almost like in a circuitous fashion, because we will get to the definition that I prefer, and it's actually many definitions, multiple definitions, is that if you look at my book, Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto, the book launch which you're having next month in March, I do talk about and partly this is why I'm happy to be on this show, because the first time I listened to your show, I hear that as I was listening, Dr. CBS likes to use the word shit, not many times, but yeah, sometimes frequently, and there's something really important actually about the notion of shit, right? So sometimes Dr. CBS says fuck that shit and so on and so forth. If you look at apartheid studies as a concept, right, I actually have two very important configurations that help me to get to a definition of apartheid. So the two configurations, on the one hand, there's what I call being full of shit, which is FOS, and then what I call being deep in shit, which I call DIS. And these are two methodological constructs. Now, how do these help us talk about the apartness that is apartheid studies, or that is apartheid? So you will see that so I started with, when I went to Ghana in 2015, I went to Elmina Castle, which is a slave dungeon, where you have the door of no return, which is where Africans were enslaved would see Africa for the last time, and then they'll be loaded onto the boats, and then they'll be put onto the slave ships. So if you get into the dungeon, you see where the slaves would have been chained, meaning that they literally slept and sat and ate in their own shit, right? And then when you go onto the door of no return, it's structured so narrowly that if you were too big, you couldn't get through. The idea being that you were supposed to go and be packed on the boats and on the slave ship. So because you are being packed like bales of cotton, and you have to be a particular weight and a particular shape and form of the body, that door was a way of measuring if you were going to be pegged in a particular way on the slave boat. And then when you look at the configuration of that slave ship, basically slaves will be, in many cases, be in what was called the spoon position, but they are pegged like sardines, very close to each other. And throughout the journey, they are living in their own shit. And then fast forward to 2014, and then in South Africa, there is a young boy who was 5 years old. His name is Michael Komape. And Michael Komape was in primary school. So he goes to school as he normally does, and then he goes to the toilet, to the bathroom, and these are pit latrines, and he never comes back. But basically he falls into the feces and he drowns. And this happens, has happened in many cases in South Africa, where many schools still have these pit latrines. So Michael Komape, young Michael Komape, literally drowns in shit. So this is where the configuration of deep in shit comes from, DIS, because I figured that the black body is deep in shit. Then on the other hand is another configuration that I call full of shit. And generally, this is a relationship that apartheid structures, where a white person can then do something that will get a black person deep in shit. But then people will simply say, oh, he's full of shit, or he's just full of shit. In other words, he cannot drown in shit because the shit is inside of him. Basically, there is a way in which structures always make sure that two people who either have committed what you could call the same crime, or two human beings, basically. You have two human beings, and yet look at the outcomes. The outcomes are so very different. So when you look at the gulf in differences, in outcomes, the gulf in outcomes is, what are the outcomes for black bodies? What are the outcomes for the oppressors? What are the outcomes? You see that, you can tell that other people, if I say a word wrong in this meeting, if it's picked up by my institution, if it's picked up by so-and-so who is in power, or whatever the case may be, the likelihood of me being deep in shit is higher and greater than what would happen if you belong to a class where, oh, look, that's what just boys do. And we've seen in America, for instance, many cases where young black kids who get shot by the police for doing something that white kids would just get waved on. It's like, oh, the kids are being kids. Maybe the police will even take them home and say to the parents, oh, these kids were getting drunk and they were being rowdy. Please watch your kids, and so on and so forth. If it was a black kid, he might not come back home. But they have to get lectures from their parents in terms of, if you're talking to a police officer, this is how you hold yourself. Because you're already deep in shit, you have to be taught all these minute lessons in terms of the way you look at someone. Just the way you look at someone might actually be considered a threat, a harmful threat, and it might actually end with you in a body bag. And so this difference between being deep in shit and being full of shit will lead us to a definition of apartheid. And so you ask, what is apartheid, Dr. CBS? And in my book, I probably have patterned apartheid in each chapter, so much so that each chapter has a definition of apartheid. So there are several definitions there, about a dozen definitions, all of them which link back to the same thing. So it's like a network of definitions. But generally, apartheid, I argue, is a rate of oppression. It's a rate of oppression in the sense that people are never oppressed in the same way, at the same time, all the time. And this is because the rate at which you're oppressed is always differentiable. So we might all march to the same Black Lives Matter protest, but then at the end of the protest, look at where we go. Then you can tell the differences between us because we do not all go back to the same place. Yes, we're chanting the same slogans. Yes, we're talking about the same theme. But then when you look at where we go after the protest, you can actually tell the different rates at which we're oppressed. And to find out what the rate of oppression is, you simply have to ask yourself, where were you and what were you doing when Michael Brown was shot, when Trayvon Martin was shot, or when Rodney King was brutalized on March 3, 1991? What were you doing, right? It doesn't mean that all Black people were being brutalized in the same way at the very same time. No, some were actually making a living, some were dancing, some were having birthday parties. And so, you know, after the birthday party, as you're driving home, maybe a policeman will stop you and then you can be deep in shit. But it means the other people who are being brutalized now maybe are back home, or they're in prison, or they're in a different place. But you can never, therefore, try to talk about oppression as if it were the same thing, even though it is the same event. But the problem is, how do we all talk about the Black experience as if it is the same thing? So this is why if we want to go to a protest, you will not find all Black people at that protest. Some will be at work. And you have to understand why they're at work. Some will be at church. And you can't say, why are you guys at church when you are protesting for your lives? Because they are acting in a way that is proportionate to their rate of oppression. They may come next week, or they'll say, look, if you had planned this protest on a Friday, I would have come. But you know that on a Saturday, my shift comes, and so I have to be at work. So I will join you next time, guys, when you plan the protest on a Friday. But then if you put it on a Friday, then the guy who came on a Friday will say, well, the problem is my son has a game on that very day, and it's his first time ever to be playing in the team, or he'll be at college. I'm driving my son or my daughter to college, and so I can't be there. You can't condemn people for doing these things. It simply means that you can never talk about the way people are oppressed in the same way and try to flatten it in such a way that everyone gets angry at the same time. No, Black people in America never get angry about oppression in the same way at the same time for the same reasons. And yet it is oppression. And these differences are what oppression utilizes to persist. It simply appropriates those differences in the way in which we feel oppression and experience oppression. And so the differences in our experiences of oppression, the very same oppression, are what I call the rate of oppression. And apartheid is the rate of oppression. It separates how we are oppressed, and it appropriates the differences and utilizes them to make sure that there can never be a proper crisis. That we never experience oppression in the same way, at the same rate, at the same time, is how oppression gets away with it all. So in my book, I then define apartheid as oppression on holiday, because you can never put oppression on trial because we can never actually sit down and see the same oppression everywhere at the same time.
As you were speaking about shit, it just reminded me of Walter Rodney. Everything reminds me of Walter Rodney, but I just want to read this little part because when he was describing the Burnham regime, he said, our language must express not only ridicule, but anger and disgust. The dictatorship has reduced us all to such a level that the situation can be described only in terms befitting filth, pollution, and excrement. Even our deep-rooted sense of modesty in Guyana cannot stand in the way of rough words to describe the nation's shame. That is why the WPA repeats the legend of King Midas, who was said to have been able to touch anything and turn it to gold. That was called the Midas touch. Now Guyana has seen the Burnham touch. Anything he touches turns to shit. So I think that, it's not only my own potty mouth, because I always like, fuck that shit, I do, but it's also like, there's something, there's something to that, this use of this shit or excrement metaphor, which, as you've described, is not, it's also literal in some cases. It's not just a metaphor or an analogy. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about the context for how you came to think about apartheid studies. So in your forthcoming journal article, Introducing Apartheid Studies, a New Forensic Inductive Philosophy for Abolishing Harm, you begin by asserting that it was the August 2012 Lawnman Massacre, which some may know as the Maracana Massacre, that solidified your realization that apartheid, in fact, never ended. So can you tell us a little bit more about why this moment in particular helped you to have that realization, and what about it brought it into such clear view for you?
So thanks for that question, Leila. So the massacre that happened on August 16, 2012 was such a shock to many people. And as we watched the videos of the miners being mown down by rifle fire by the police, there was just this sense that we had reached a limit point, we had reached the threshold. It was just so, it defied words. But anyone who watches that video just shakes their head in disbelief. And for me, watching the events of that day, I just sense that, look, this is the apocalypse. Surely we have to stop everything that we're doing. We have to stop everything and just say, how can this happen? And this must never happen again. If we do not stop everything that we're doing to focus on the conditions that allow these kinds of things to actually happen, then look, I cannot understand what is going on. But the feeling that I had was we had reached a limit point, because this cannot just happen to human beings. So when I went to bed, because the video was on the news on a loop. So when I went to bed, I half expected to wake up on the 17th and something major to happen, something apocalyptic, something that really has to accord with what had happened. But surprisingly, life was going on as it had gone on the 15th of August. And for me, this was a wake-up call, because I actually realized that there are patterns in our lives or capacities that are hardwired for life going on, even if life has ended for others. So if you look at the families of those 34 miners who were butchered by the police on that day, so in my book, for instance, I try to just trace a little bit where they are, but basically a large part of their lives stopped on that day. But it was their lives and their families' lives and their sons and their brothers and uncles' lives that stopped. When I looked around, when I walked in the streets, no actually life was going on. And for me, it basically opened up for me a whole new way of looking at the world, because I'd always wondered, so why has oppression continued for 300 or 400 years for Africans, for Black people around the world, for people in Latin America and South America, people in Asia and so on? How can oppression be so persistent? Because I'd always been wondering that surely we talk about freedom. We like to talk about freedom. We like to talk about emancipation and liberation. But if you look at the data set, we have more, if we're talking just in terms of a sample size, we have lived more in oppression rather than in freedom. The data shows that human beings have lived longer under oppression than in its absence. So if you're someone who works using the data, let's say you want to build a company or a new algorithm or a new tool, or if you use the data to inform that new invention, the data you have with you that we're drawing from human history is likely to tell you that these people have lived longer under oppression than freedom. In other words, the usable data set, the data set that is going to give you more results that you can optimize, that are scalable and so on, is actually the data that says, yes, it's not, oppression is not good, harm is not good, violence is not good, but actually it's the staple. You know, it's what we have lived under for longer than we care to remember. So yes, it's good to free people, but the data set for what people do when they are free, it actually doesn't exist. It's very small. The sample size is very small. But look at the data set for what people do when they are under oppression, and it's huge. And under that data set, you find out that people go on getting married and marrying, having kids, having birthdays, going to school, having degrees. And then what does it do to planners? It means to planners, they have observed that life actually doesn't end. The proof, just the data set shows that life actually goes on. Yes, some people do die. Yes, bad things do happen. But by and large, look at all the cities that have been built during that time when people were saying, oh, you know, this is the darkest time of our history and so on and so forth. Look at the cities that have been built. Look at the inventions that were made. Look at how modernity was built. Modernity was built right at the moment when we were saying, you know, this is dark. And at exactly that time, life was going on. So if you are looking at the data will tell you that oppression does not stop life going on. It does not stop you building skyscrapers, building schools, building colleges. They are compatible. So we tend to think that they are incompatible, that if you oppress people, the world will end. Actually, the data set shows you that no, in most cases, actually life goes on. And so this is very reassuring to an oppressor, because if it wasn't, they were going to stop. Because what it would mean, it would mean that whatever they are building is going to just blow away in a puff of dust. But they've observed that no, the oppressed themselves have a certain capacity, a capacity to what I call demote. You know, demotion. I use a concept that I call demotion in my book. But basically, what it means is if you face a situation that is harmful, that is difficult, you simply do what I call demotion, which is that you deal with the shortage or the harm in the form of a fraction. So if you find out that you can no longer live on a loaf of bread, then you find ways to live on half a loaf of bread. And you complain for that week that, look, this is less food, we don't like it, the kids are crying. After 2 months, you are used to that half loaf of bread, and it becomes the new normal. And then you find out that you can't even afford that half loaf. And then you move on to some other form of food, whether you get yams or sweet potatoes or whatever it is, and on and on and on and on, because you always find a way to demote. You think someone is going to die, and yet you come back and you find out that they are not dead. They are still demoting and finding ways to adapt and to make things work. And I got this example of demotion from looking at the example of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, New Mexico, where if you look at the dead zone, it's a place that microbiologists have seen that it's so polluted that there's no life there. Right? It's so polluted that there's no life. And so they say dead zone is basically a place where there's no life because there's no oxygen. But then after a few years, they went back and they started seeing, hold on, signs of life. In that place where there shouldn't be life, they find out there are some organisms that actually are living there. And they're not only living there, they are starting to thrive. And it makes you revise what you had thought about the dead zone. You thought the dead zone means the end of life, and yet there are certain organisms that have a capacity to actually learn to live where there is no oxygen. So when you take away oxygen or resources that human beings need to live, you think, oh, this is going to be the end. And then you come back a few years later, you find out that there is life. And so when I look at places where Black bodies live all across the world, in the townships, in the ghettos, these are dead zones. These are places where human beings cannot live, should not live. And you think life is going to end. But when you come back after 5 years, after 15 years, there is a culture. There's a ghetto culture there. People have started to call it home. It's the only place they know. And they start to shape their whole identities around the dead zone. And to an oppressor, that is so reassuring, because what it means is you can actually create more dead zones, and people can get used to them. And for me, this solves an important problem, which is the problem of infinite growth on a finite world. Because if they can do with less, it means you can always invoice them with all the crises of the world, and they will absorb them. So you actually create a class of shock absorbers who are always there to absorb the crisis of the world. And so you no longer have to worry about infinite growth in a finite world, because some people do with less. So now if you come to South Africa, you find what they call shake upgrading schemes, where you have a slum that people you wanted to remove at a certain point in time. Then they say, look, just leave it there. And then 20 years later, they actually want to upgrade the slum and redesign it so that you actually stay there permanently. They're doing the same with the refugee camps. These are supposed to be emergencies where people shouldn't live for more than 2 or 3 years or even months. When you live in a refugee camp for 15 years, then they say, hang on, this is actually a new mode of life. And then they actually make it a model for how people can live in a harmful place, in a harmful situation for the rest of their lives. And so we are producing data sets. We, the oppressed, are producing data sets that the oppressed are actually looking at and saying, you know what, kids can grow up in such places. Yes, you may not live in Manhattan, but in the Bronx, you can grow up there, you can go to school, you can graduate, and even put it up on your Facebook that, you know what, I grew up in such a difficult environment, look at me. And you think, look, I think it's important because, and it's an inspiring story because you fought against the odds. But your story is a data point, which for anyone who is doing a study on modeling society, you're actually showing that growing up in hardship is actually, could actually be optimized for success. This is why they are looking at resilience now as a model for how the world can live. This is why they are talking about sustainability now, because they found out that poor people are so sustainable. They can tighten their belts again and again and again and again. And they say, you know what, there is something here. There's something going on here. When you reduce the intake of protein, people don't actually die. They adapt to the reduced protein. And so, we've been using too much protein. So let's cut down and let's have a new model of doing these things. And so after 16 August 2012, I realized that this is not a mistake, because we tend to look at these things as exceptions, as mistakes, as accidents, as it shouldn't happen. I actually realized that, in fact, these things are structured in a very systemic way, that in fact, this is how history has happened more often than not. More frequently than not, we actually have lived like this. We tend to look at them as freakish accidents, as exceptions. No, they are not. So the 17th of August for me, Leila, to answer a question in a roundabout and circuitous way, taught me that people will live with things that they shouldn't, not because they want to live with those things, not because they like those things, but that's actually the other way we need to start defining oppression. Oppression in a very primitive sense is easy to see, it's easy to detect, it's easy to point out and to label. But when oppression becomes apartheid, it becomes undetectable. It becomes intertwined with you paying your bills. It becomes intertwined with, the student debt. It becomes intertwined with transport, with fees, with rents, with your career, with things that you love to do. And so how do you remove oppression that basically is you? Because oppression at the very end of, if you take this perspective to its logical conclusion, oppression is us, in the sense that it is inbuilt into our aspirations, it is inbuilt into our desires, because that's what happens when you live long enough under harm and under oppression. You don't have to like it, but live long enough under harm, and that refugee camp becomes home, and that slum becomes home, and that ghetto becomes home. So for me, I'm just talking about data. When you live long enough in harm, you produce data, and the data shows people certain things. And those certain things are given back to us as models that actually says, this is how you guys live. And you can't fight with it, because yes, that is actually how we've lived for 50 years, for 100 years. So what are we going to do with this data that is surrounding us, that shows that Black people can live in ghettos for all their lives? It is there, the data is there.
It's so interesting because everything, as you're taught, I have this whole theory about the structural location of Blackness that says a lot of what you're saying. So for example, one aspect of Blackness for me is the absorption of capital risk, right? I got the idea from the Panic of 1837 and the way that enslaved folks functioned as commodities, as currency, but also as literal use value. So there's a way that Blackness absorbed, and then also, if you look at like the housing crisis, right? Black people absorbed that crisis because it was just, we're just going to take your shit and you're going to be homeless now. And then the economy reconstitute itself. So that there's just so much to say about, like, you know, everything you laid out. There's just so much synergy between sort of apartheid studies and then racial capitalism studies. And so that brings me to my question about sort of, how does your understanding of apartheid differ from other approaches? Because, for example, the racial capitalism studies that come out of South Africa link apartheid, the system of apartheid, or the sort of structure of apartheid, to global capital, to global capital in the way that it segmented the labor market, and specifically mining, and how you can pay differential wages, et cetera, right? So that's linked to capital. My understanding of Blackness is linked to capitalism and the super exploitation and expropriation that accrues around Black racialized bodies, right? So I just wondered, and then I guess also, are you making sort of an ontological argument like the Afro-pessimists? So mine is a sort of capitalist one, right? How do you come to your understanding of apartheid? Like, what are the sort of modes of thought that you're using to develop your particular framework?
Thanks for that question. It's a really powerful question, because it speaks to why I sat down and wrote the 4 volumes of the manifesto. First of all, I asked myself, who named it apartheid? And you find out that it wasn't us, right? Apartheid is a word that comes out from the Dutch Reformed Church in the late 1920s, and from the Broederbond, which is an Afrikaner secret society, which was working behind the scenes to control how things were going in the public sphere. And they were using it as a euphemism, as something that was good. So they came up with the word apartheid to represent separation, to say, you know, our outcomes should be separate from these people, because we are just different, we are the chosen ones, or whatever the case may be. And so it was their word. So the way we end up using apartheid much later was actually reappropriation. It was meant for, the oppressor came up with a particular word to describe society. So that was apartheid. And then with time, the word went into general use, first by politicians, and then commentators and intellectuals and historians. And they started to use it to represent a particular system. But to this day, we've never heard the term that the oppressed themselves, and here I'm talking about the generality of the oppressed, we do not have the term of what they called it. The word itself, the word apartheid, is a top-down descriptor of what is actually going on. So what you have in the normative understanding of apartheid is what the elites frame what is going on down there. They are mostly insulated from that life, but they call it apartheid. So I've always been fascinated but what did the oppressed themselves call this? How did they describe and explain their own experiences? And I found out that there was a disconnect between what the top-down description and what was going on below were saying. There was a disconnect there. This is why around the in the mid-1970s, as the anti-apartheid struggle gained momentum in South Africa and in Europe, in America, and so on, the Afrikaners themselves started to disown the word. So they started saying apartheid is dead, right? So the word had been appropriated and was now being used to signal the anti-apartheid struggle. So they said, no, apartheid is gone, it's dead. And they started bringing up new words like separate development and whatnot. But the activists stuck to the use of the word. They said apartheid is there. If apartheid is dead, where is the cops? We need to see the cops. We look around ourselves and we still see the outcomes. So people hang on to the use of that word. And then when you check how apartheid was lived, what was, the condition that we describe as apartheid, it is actually very different to how the elites have called it, whether it's historians, whether it's commentators and so on. They tend, for instance, to impose dates on this condition. So they say it started in 1948, which is really absurd because are you saying a family which was living in a slum in 1947 was not living under apartheid? Then they put another date much later on, then they say 94, they say it's gone, right? So it's easy when you're talking about something from the top to impose dates when it starts and deadlines when it finishes, and then tell people to move on because you know what, according to our estimation, this thing is no longer there. So that's what happened in South Africa. The people who abrogated themselves the right to name apartheid then said it starts in a certain year, which is nonsense. And then they also say it ended on a certain date, 10 May 1994 is when they say it ended. And you can see how this is just absurd because if you're living in 1995, you're being told that it's gone, and yet you look around and you see that actually your life, the conditions are still the same. And there's a lady who I quote a lot in my book, Judith Sikade. She's from Cape Town. And she was interviewed in 2017. And she said, she was asked about transformation in South Africa, change and so on. Have things changed? And she said, all I can tell you, my son, is that in 1994, I was living in a shack, plastic and cardboard shack. In 2017, I'm still living in a shack. That's all I'm going to tell you. So when I look at all of that, I started asking very different questions. I was no longer asking these questions about arbitrary dates, about when these things start and when these things end. I was now looking at apartheid not as a system either of racial segregation or a system of oppression, because once you call it a system of oppression, it means you have a model, you have a methodology which you can fit, you have a particular way of looking at it, and then it becomes a system to you. But my question is, how did these white historians, liberal historians who were writing about apartheid, how do they know it, right? How do they know what they were writing about? They never carried a passbook, for instance, a dom pass. So how do you talk about the plight of people who carry a passbook, about how bad carrying a passbook is? How do you even know? It's something you never experienced, but you're an expert in it. So for me, I actually discounted their definition of apartheid because they never experienced it. And there's a problem if you don't experience a certain form of oppression, but you're an expert in it because you reduce it to a particular system. That fits your expertise and that fits your career trajectory and whatnot, so that you can be brought on TV and then you can say, the thing with apartheid is like this. And when apartheid ended, so you hear all these historians and they go on TV and they say, when apartheid ended, And that always makes me so mad, because I'm like, how do they know apartheid ended when they didn't live it, right? The person who lived apartheid should be the person who says when apartheid ended, because they could see that it had ended. And so you need to offset the costs of oppression by basically invoicing the costs of oppression on the oppressed themselves. So what it means is, even if the slave master is not there, the plantation work still goes on as if he is there. Even if he's halfway around the world, slavery still continues. And I find that I actually do the same things with my kids, that even when I'm in another town 500 kilometers away and they are being naughty, all their mother has to do is say, I'm going to call your daddy. I'm not there. And I'm so far away. But then say, no, don't tell daddy. We won't do that anymore. Where is that power, that influence, where you don't have to be physically present for something to take effect? And then you realize that oppression has phases, right? It has a primitive phase. Right? It is a primitive phase where the oppressor has to have a form of physical presence. But after people have lived in oppression long enough, you can go, but it will reproduce itself. And so for me, when I started looking at apartheid, I reached a point in history where I actually saw apartheid disappear. Not because it had gone away, but simply because we'd lived with it long enough. And that is the importance of having this phase where the oppressor is physically present, because the idea is that after you live long enough in oppression, it means you can actually maintain oppression itself without the oppressor needing to be there. Why? Because you have to live, you have to eat, you have to clothe your children, you have to go to school. It becomes part of your daily life. So just provision for people to live long enough, maybe 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is, and you no longer need to worry about being there every day. You no longer need to hold a button and point people in the way they should go. They will go there themselves. So after a while, apartheid itself enjoys leaving race out of the picture, because it can operate with race and without race. It is now optional. So with apartheid at a very advanced stage, race becomes optional. It is part of a menu of options it can use, and race is just one of them. So when oppression is so advanced, race is just one of the things it can utilize. It can use gender. It can use the poverty datum line. It can use any option from the menu and deploy it, and it can pull it back. And when it pulls back, you have nowhere to stand on. So you find Black people, once you sort of show that, but this is not racism, then they have to start to say, okay, maybe it's not explicitly racist, but it's connected somehow. Well, it's not even that it's connected. It is the same thing. It was always the same thing. But what it has done is just put you on the back foot, because it is framing this problem as exceptional. And in South Africa, after 1994, apartheid is exceptional now. Apartheid is gone. So if you talk about apartheid, they call them legacies of apartheid. So, you can't talk about legacies as if it is the thing. So even our discussions on apartheid are supposed to be framed as an archive, right? As something which has run its course, and then there still hold out little corners here and there, farmers and a few other people and so on and so forth, who still have not transformed. And for me, I do think we need to reframe all of that. And so the theoretical framework of apartheid studies tries to show that no, our focus has been sometimes maybe misdirected in places where I think we need to go to the people who live these things. People who live slavery can tell that slavery did not end. But once the framing had changed, it becomes difficult for you to claim that slavery had ended, because they say, okay, where is the plantation? Because they had said slavery is the plantation, when slavery was actually particular modes of practice that were invoiced in the slaves themselves, so that if the slave left the plantation, they still carried slavery with them. Wherever they went, they still reproduced slavery. And so I think broadly, that's why I got to a point where I felt that without necessarily saying the other frameworks that exist, whether decolonization, racial capitalism, internal colonialism, many of these frameworks that existed, I without necessarily saying that they are wrong, and they are not wrong, I actually just shifted attention to a particular area of how oppression works that I think they had bothered not to look at, because, I mean, who cares about the experience of the oppressed when, we in the colleges and in the universities can write about it in a more articulate way.
That brings up so many things. There's so many things I think that come up from that conversation. One of which is I'm thinking about last week we had a conversation with Yannick Marshall, and we were talking about his own experience as a Caribbean descended person in Canada. And one of the pieces that he wrote, which was about the fact that there is no, there's no benevolent form of settler colonialism. It also helps me think about some of the ways that South Africa handled the lockdown around COVID, right? Like I think about the deaths of Collins Kosa and Petrus Miggles, and thinking, and it your framing just helps me think about your assertion that apartheid never ended. Helps me think about why it makes sense in the South African context to be able to make alcohol and cigarettes illegal in this moment, and then it becomes the justification for this extra version of policing that then results in the deaths of people for things that are otherwise completely normal and typical in daily lives. And it just, I don't know, thinking about some of the critiques that are out there about what it means to think about like what the problems are around thinking about resilience as our ways of responding to things, because it, as you so clearly pointed out, it makes our continued oppression so possible because of the ways that we continue to just be as human beings, right? So there's just so many things that come up for me. But I want to shift gears slightly, just a little bit. So I came to know your work when I was in South Africa during that year, 2020, and I had the opportunity to sit in on one of your workshops as you were thinking about apartheid studies coming into being. And one of the things that came up towards the end of the workshop that I sat in on was your own thoughts about how do we have these conversations in sort of extra academic space, right? So like, not that they're non-academic, but that they take places sort of beyond the paywalls of academic journals and outside of what we understand to be the confines of peer review, although still requiring some form of peer review. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you hope to think about one, in a general sense, how you hope to think about what it means to publish works outside of the academy to make them available and useful for people who are not necessarily academics in the traditional sense. And then also how you hope apartheid studies may be taken up beyond the South African context. I think for me, obviously, Palestine becomes a very salient example or place to think about how apartheid studies can be useful to think about. But I'm curious, are there other places that you might think that would benefit from or help expand your own understanding of apartheid studies?
Thank you, Leila. So I see two strands to your question, and the first one is that if you look at the book that eventually I wrote, and I call it a book in quotation marks because as a manifesto, or what I call a manifesto, I made several very deliberate decisions in writing this book. For instance, I chose to publish the book with a small independent publisher. I could have, taken the book to Palgrave or Routledge and a university press, many of these established presses. But then I wondered if, for instance, if I was going to be able to write the book I wanted. And I'll tell you why. So for instance, initially, the book was supposed to be 80,000 words. And then when we go to 80,000 words, I found out that in fact I'd written a manuscript that was 120,000 words long. So I had a chat with the publisher and I said, oh, look, we have to cut down all the way back to 80,000. They said, why must you cut down? This is your story. This is something you feel keenly about. And if it goes beyond 80,000 words, we'll keep writing. Why must you cut down something you feel has to be there? And so I continued writing. And the book was supposed to be done by 2016. But I just didn't feel right. I felt that my writing had to gestate, it had to sit there, it had to ferment, I had to go back to it. And I felt a lot of things were happening that needed me to reflect and pause and rewrite and so on. And so 7 years later, I was still writing the book. And I do not think a traditional publisher was going to be patient with me, number one. Number two, I do not think that they were going to stand for a book that was supposed to be 80,000 words long, ending up at 300,000 words long. So I was privileged to meet this publisher who is an Eritrean, but now a naturalized American from New Jersey, who has operated a Pan-African publisher since 1983. And he basically calls me his son. We met in Pretoria at a conference, and I spoke to him about the events of 16 August 2012 and how I felt that we needed to speak about why did life go on the 17th as if nothing had happened, and I wanted to write about it and so on. And he said, my son, this is so important. I was in the struggle in the 70s. I was in the socialist struggle in Africa, East Africa, and so on. And when what you're talking about is an angle that I feel would really enrich how we see, the world order, how things have happened, and so on and so forth. So he said, go on, write a book, we'll publish it. And so every time I went to him, sheepishly, wondering if he was going to just say, look, we can't go on like this, he encouraged me. And that was so different to how I know many people have been treated by publishers. Many people are told your ideas are a little bit too radical. These won't read well in an academic setting. You have to quote so and so. You have to do this and that. And they basically change your work and make it part your work and part what is expected out there. And so I made a political decision not to publish with one of these standard publishers. That was number one. And then number two, I will be launching the Journal of Apartheid Studies this year, and we'll be launching the first international conference of apartheid studies again this year. But the way I'm thinking about apartheid studies, the journal, is it is not going to be a journal that you sit down and write a 6,000 word article and find all the right ways to put in there, and then you submit to our journal and we publish it. We are looking at a very different way of publishing. And you see that the journal will be in a format that in a way you can call a visual format, but you see the way you have TikTok videos as things that everyone watches, that many people watch, and many people enjoy. You think, okay, what if I could package an intellectual argument in the form of a TikTok video? So I've written more than 25 journal articles, but my mother has not read a single one. She does not know what they are about. She appreciates that her son is clever, is a professor at the university and he writes clever things, but she will never read any of the things I write because she can't understand them. The language is just not catered for her. And so we live in silos and we publish in silos. But my mom, who went just only up to grade 7, can understand TikTok videos, has been able to, she can use her phone, her smartphone very cleverly. She never went to school to learn how to use a phone and how to use social media, but she can understand what these videos are communicating, whether they are funny, they're serious, and so on and so forth. So we have thought about tapping a little bit into how do we communicate in a way that the people we are writing about and the people we intend to impact with some of these explanations. What if we wrote in a way that puts a lot of the power in their hands, as opposed to putting the power in the hands of so-called experts. So the Journal of Apartheid Studies is actually going to be you, Leila, uploading your thoughts in a 2-minute video, and then you upload it, and then people can comment it. It's not a full journal article yet. Then a few weeks later, you publish another snippet, another fragment, you add a few words. So there's still room for you to type whatever you want to type. If you want to cite a source, you can cite a source. But your work is actually going to be able to be, you can tweet your work, you can share it on WhatsApp, and it's going to be commented on. And then when maybe after 3 years, you have enough of those videos to make, let's say, 1 hour, then it's an article. And then you can actually put it in your CV, just like any article that has been published out there. But you can see that the journal article is on its way out. There's no way look, it's not going to die, but as a way of packaging knowledge out there, it represents a system that actually needs to be let to die. And so there are going to be many changes in the way in which we disseminate information. And I want the Journal of Apartheid Studies to be a very different journal. And where even the peer review process is transparent. We can have videos of your peer reviewers commenting on your little snippet of video and saying that, oh, look, it's very nice, or it's nonsense, or whatever it is. The way we comment on TikTok videos. And it can be anyone who can comment on it, but we all have a range of expertise. My mother has some very good expertise on certain things, but she didn't go to university, but she can comment with knowledge on certain things. And she can be a peer reviewer as well for some of your work, for parts of your work, not for all of it, but for a certain 10-second segment, she can tell you, this is not how we used to put on these costumes. This is a very different way of putting on an African costume. So she can peer review that part of your paper. If you package it as a snippet of a video, she looks at it and she says, that is very correct. We used to do it that way. It was called so and so and so and so. I agree with, your question was, how we can frame some of the dialogues and conversations beyond the traditional academy. And it's one of the things that has always excited my attention, how to make apartheid studies, at least in part, very different, how we disseminate it. I feel that it is a field of study that can be seen in barbershops, in taxi ranks, in farm compounds, in all these slum settlements, in places where we do not normally associate with the production and reproduction of knowledge. This is where I've got most of the important knowledge that is in my book. I never got it in universities. I got it amongst the people. So I'm looking for a way, and I'm actually trying to build networks right now and work with many young people to take the discussion of apartheid studies to churches, to barbershops, to taxi ranks, to vegetable markets, because I do know that people do talk about these things every day, how oppression persists in a way that is entangled with their daily lives. So I just want to go to those daily lives and talk about household expenditure, because apartheid talks about household expenditure, and talk about, our people's circadian rhythms, how we wake up at 6 every day, or how we have shifts in the week, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how this thing goes, but my hope and my intention is that more and more we can start to speak to other constituencies that do not necessarily appear to look, the way we expect. And then you did ask about, sorry for the part about Palestine. I do think that Palestine is an important part of the apartheid studies project, actually, because number one, the big problem we have right now with the so-called Palestine question is that people say Israel is an apartheid state, but they've never expended the effort and the work to define apartheid. And that is very problematic. If you are going to label Israel an apartheid state, then do the work of defining apartheid properly. So they just rush to define Israel as an apartheid state prematurely. I feel that we need to do the work of defining apartheid. So when you ask them, okay, why is Israel an apartheid state? They say, well, look, there's the Rome Statute, and the Rome Statute said apartheid was a crime against humanity. But then you say, the Rome Statute is not the one that makes apartheid. There was still going to be apartheid with or without the Rome Statute, because that is part of the problem when you frame things in a positivistic way. Apartheid becomes the Rome Statute. And if you remove the Rome Statute, if the UN wakes up one day and says, oh, we made a mistake, we're not supposed to do that, we're not supposed to frame apartheid as a crime against humanity, then you have no leg to stand on, because you let apartheid be defined by a statute first and foremost. And so everything is dependent on what that statute says. And yet apartheid was a lived phenomenon, whether or not the UN wanted or decided to frame it in a particular way. Apartheid exists in a very particular way, in a particular historical form that does not need the UN to legitimize. So 2 years ago when de Klerk, the last apartheid president of South Africa, when he says he wasn't aware that apartheid was a crime of humanity against humanity, all South Africa went up in arms. He said, how could he was an apartheid president, he's saying he didn't know. He said, I'm not aware. What does Thabo Mbeki do? Thabo Mbeki goes and takes a copy of the Rome Statute and brings it to de Klerk and says, here's proof that apartheid was a crime against humanity. I mean, that is absurd. How can you give this last white president of apartheid a book, a document, and say, here is proof, read it. If you don't believe me, read it. And then he read it and says, yeah. After reading it, I sort of agree that, yeah, apartheid was a crime against humanity. But there is a problem already, because, if you look at the Jewish Holocaust, the Jewish people have never let the UN tell them that the Holocaust happened. They will not let external bodies frame the Holocaust for them. They frame it the way they like. And they will not let other people define what it is for them, whether or not we agree with the framing of it, but they do not let the UN tell them when the Holocaust began, when it ended, what it was, and so on. And yet we have let the UN tell us that apartheid was a crime against humanity, but we know it was a crime against humanity. We don't need the UN to tell us that. So everyone who has said Israel is an apartheid state, if you ask them what is apartheid, they say, I think, what happened in South Africa? Then the UN then came up with a statute. So that is what is happening in Palestine. And therefore, Israel is an apartheid state. And for me, that is very bad. That is very bad knowledge. We need to actually properly define apartheid from the point of view of the oppressed. And we've never done that. We've just taken a label and we found it very convenient and we've started to use it. So part of the work that I'm doing, for instance, is defining apartheid as it is experienced, defining apartheid as the oppressed would experience it. So what the people of Gaza are going through is apartheid. You don't need the UN to then come and then check and monitor and say, yes, it is actually apartheid. Or say, no, it hasn't reached the threshold. Remember when the Rwandan genocide was happening, people, Clinton was debating, and in the US, is it or is it not a genocide? Has it reached a genocide level yet? And some was, it hasn't got there yet. No, it hasn't yet. But people were dying, millions were dying, hundreds of thousands were dying, were being killed and so on. But people were fighting around, has it reached that definition yet? Why? Because it benefits the status quo, because then they know they can control when to trigger sanctions, they can control when to trigger military support or military intervention. So it's all about them making sure that whatever is happening in Rwanda or Haiti or Palestine is not a crisis. This is why they have power over the definitions of whether what is happening is this or that, because they can control whether it's a crisis or not. So what is happening in Palestine is not a crisis. It doesn't matter how many children die, but those who control the definition will tell you, look, it hasn't reached the threshold where, you know. So until the people of Gaza, the people of Ramallah, the people of Haiti, and the people of Congo are the ones who frame the definition of what is going on in their countries to them, we are always going to wait on the experts to tell us whether they think it has reached that level yet. And then they say, oh, according to our definition, maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. So yeah, I do think that apartheid studies for me is actually, now we are going to properly see that Israel is an apartheid state, not because of the Rome Statute, but because the form of oppression that is going on in Gaza is taking particular forms and particular patterns. That's all you need to reach that threshold. You do not need an expert. You just need to observe the forms of oppression that are going there. Today, people in Palestine go and work in Israel. They go, people are forced to destroy their own homes today. They don't have to do it. You destroy your own homes. They can get you to uproot your olive groves yourself. Otherwise, they will do it themselves, and so on and so forth. But you can tell that the suffering in Gaza reached, well, it was always apartheid. It reached that threshold a long time ago. But the problem is we define the experience of people who are going through those things. We are not going through those things, but we actually have a prerogative to say whether it is or whether it is not. So all the talk of apartheid, Israel being an apartheid state without apartheid studies, for me, is very problematic. You need to study apartheid first, systematically, formally, over many years, in a very sustained way, so that when you call it apartheid, you're not just saying it's because of the Rome Statute, which is more than 50 years old, and which was frankly done in a very, if you want, insufficient way. The people who framed the Rome Statute had very little understanding of what was going on in South Africa. They were doing it for very particular geopolitical aims at the UN. So yeah, I do think that apartheid studies can help us look at what is going on in Haiti, in Palestine, in the Congo, in Detroit, where you have that 8-mile road that basically separates lives in Detroit, and you have got towns that sit next to each other, and the outcomes are so different. And you wonder, how is this normal, and how has this gone on for so many years, and how is it there's no crisis? So it doesn't matter whether it's a favela in Rio, whether it's in Mumbai, in India. I do think that you can read the rate of oppression in many of these places, and therefore apartheid for me is a global paradigm that allows us to look at how oppression goes on. And ultimately, my hope is that we can actually be able to undo this. Because the idea is, if you can tell how oppression persists and how it is us, because apartheid studies focuses on us. It doesn't focus on the oppressor. And this is very different to many frameworks that have existed before. They try to focus on the role of the oppressor. If you look at Marxism, Marxism studied the bourgeoisie, it studies the capitalist, it studies the ruling class a lot. And a lot of time is spent studying the ruling class. And yet they do not observe how the ruling class is always on holiday. They are literally sometimes, I mean, they are in the Caribbean when it's winter in Europe and so on and so forth. And they've got holiday homes. And when you study them and you spend all of your time to understand the ruling class, you don't observe that, in fact, it's us. The maintenance is invoiced on us. We are the ones who actually do this because we are the shock absorbers. So for once, I stopped studying the oppressors. I study the oppressed. So apartheid studies the oppressed, because this is where it's at. We have stopped, what's the word? Obsessing or being preoccupied with what the ruling class does, with what the bourgeoisie does, because they are not the productive majority. They produce nothing. They are, in any case, in a minority when it comes to being oppressed. They will always be in the majority. So we need to understand how we can get out of this system. And for me, we will be able to do that once we're able to see that it is us. It is all about us. It has always been about us. And we can then split, sort of like split the veil and see through the black box. And we hope that apartheid as a theory of liberation can help to undo this very dark phase of modernity that we're living in.
I'm just going to have to push back a little bit about Marxism, Leninism, especially as it emanates from the global South. They've systematically studied the working class. And especially if you take, the folks who I feel like took Fanon's sort of invitation seriously, that you have to stretch Marxism when it comes to the colonial question. When you think about people like Walter Rodney, for example, who, I always think about, and even more sort of like for people who are in Marxist-Leninist parties, I think they're systematically studying the working class, because that's where revolution comes from. Like, when I read Claudia Jones and she's talking about the experience of, or the realities of Black women, right? The intersection of oppression and exploitation of Black women, they're not just studying the bourgeoisie. That's not how revolution works. And so I don't know. And I was just also struck. It makes sense in terms of how you say apartheid studies is focused on the oppressed, because I noticed that you don't talk about capitalism. Like you have not said the word capitalism one time really, or imperialism, or even exploitation. It's just really interesting. Like, that's not a critique. It's just really interesting to see the different sort of conceptual frameworks or terminologies that are useful to what it is that you're trying to convey, which sort of leads to the last question, which is about the manifesto form, right? Part of what I was thinking about during my writing reflection last week was about how it is that we use particular genres of writing to convey our ideas. And so I wondered, what does the manifesto form allow you to do as apart from a conventional sort of book or, monograph? And then I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the structure and contents of your 4-volume work, Apartheid Studies and Manifesto, and how it helps you to put apartheid on trial, which is, I think, one of your overarching aims. And then you wrote in that work on page 71, like, we cannot properly study apartheid if we do not examine the multiple doors and wormholes through which apartheid could slip through, emerge and reemerge, appear and disappear, and turn and return. And again, I just wondered if your unique approach to apartheid studies helps you to sort of examine those different contours.
Thank you very much, Dr. CBS, for that question, and also for the pushback against sort of my framing of Marxism and some of the sort of the radical politics that arose out of that. I think this is a discussion we can have for another day and on another forum. So when I sort of propose or pose this critique against, let's say, Marxism, it's not to say that Marxism doesn't focus on the lower class, for instance, so-called lower class or the working class. So of course it does. It is actually based majorly on that, but it is based on how then the idea is there's a conflict between that class and the ruling class and the bourgeoisie. And once you do that, it legitimizes the bourgeoisie in a certain way. In fact, it says that because if you call them the ruling class and their ideas, the ruling ideas, there's a certain legitimization going on of that particular class, because if you have to remove them, you have to legitimize them. So a lot of the work that Marx does is trying to show that this enemy exists and this enemy is formidable, and we will need to do all our best to remove this enemy. And so in the end, the class struggle, for it to emerge as something that we can frame and have a discussion about, there has to be a struggle. Whether it's the Hegelian thesis, antithesis, you have to have both sides there. If you have to have, in the end, the abolition of the ruling class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, you have to see the ruling class and the bourgeoisie as existing, as a particular essence in society, with power, with money, owning the land, and so on and so forth. So I have reached a very different conclusion. And like I'm saying, we might not have sort of the sort of all the time now to discuss that. And a lot of this is also laid out in the 4 volumes. But the long and short of it for me is that I've looked at revolutions and I've basically put all of them in quotation marks, because I've asked myself, has there been revolutions before? And when you consider that, you see that we've had revolutions only up to a point. There's a point at which all revolutions break down, and they always break down at the point where each and every participant in the revolution considers their rate of oppression. And then you start to see cleavages, whether it's cleavages in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, then tribalism kicks in, colorism kicks in, and all sorts of things kick in. And then suddenly the revolutionaries are splitting, and then you have 5 parties, and then in the end, some are co-opted, and then we have to start again, and again, and again. And that cycle, you can follow any revolution that has happened. The rate of oppression always comes in to show the fractures in every single revolution, at every single time. And I've always asked myself, why have we not managed to have revolutions that actually overthrow the status quo? Because that was always the intention. They always overthrow it up to a certain point. And so I've been fascinated by how the rate of oppression fractures all revolutions. I've looked at many examples, and I've looked at the point at which they fracture, the point at which comrades sit around the table and they start throwing accusations and ask, at what point do comrades start saying, no, the problem with you is this. It doesn't mean that oppression is gone. It doesn't mean that we don't see capitalism as a problem, but look at the point at which revolution starts to fracture. And so for me, that is what fascinates me. So it's not because my interest is attacking Marxism or my interest is talking about capitalism per se. It's simply just shift attention to something else, and which is that we've never had a single revolution that has gone on to its ultimate aims. At some point, it has started to fracture, and the fracturing has always happened along the lines of the rate of oppression. This is why I said after every Black Lives Matter march, where do we go after that march? We don't go to the same place. Some don't have food after that march. Some have food. Some go for parties with their friends. Some go back to read books. Some go to church to pray. But we don't all go to the same place. And once you solidify those differences, that is how the cleavages start. That is how the fractures are basically built upon. But like I said, it's a discussion that I think we actually should have in a future installment, because it is an important discussion that needs to be had. It's how do we put apartheid on trial? And the question of this manifesto is a particular form of structuring how I wrote the book. I think that one of the ways we can put apartheid on trial is to talk about, in a way, it's actually a very simple move, but getting there becomes the difficult part, getting there to the point where you can make the simple move. So the simple move for me is actually exposing that it has always been us. It's exposing our whole contribution to everything that has just happened. And if we can show that if we can strip the veil from this, it means it's done. There's a proverb in my language that says, a snake that you have seen is no longer dangerous, right? The issue is, as long as you haven't seen it, it could strike you from anywhere. The danger could be anyone, could be everywhere. But once you see it, it can be there, but you've already seen it. You have located the danger. And the importance becomes, if you realize that the house that they have been living in is a stolen house, the wealth that has been their wealth, the wealth that has sustained the ruling class, is actually not their wealth. That if you're able to strip through this illusion, actually you don't need to change much. You actually need to just shift to showing that the people they call parasites are the productive majority, which is the truth. But because the framing has been of parasites, has been about welfare, has been about people who live off the system, and we have to do something about it. The distance we have to cover to actually show that, in fact, these are the shock absorbers. These are the people who have enabled modernity up to this point. So there's a shift that needs to come for us to put apartheid on trial. And in my book, I've outlined the moves that I think need to be made to get to a point where we can strip the veil off. So putting apartheid on trial for me is a simple question of covering that distance between reality and what we've been told is the reality. And the reality is what we are living. But we've been told that the way that we're living is actually surplus to requirements. And it's actually the opposite. It's not, it is the foundation of the world. But how do you tell people that you are the foundation of the world? How do you tell so-called crack mothers that they are the foundation of the world? How do you tell people in the ghetto that they are the basis for everything that we call the American system? That Africa is actually whatever we think is so-called modernity is something that is nourished by people who actually are not on the news, are hardly ever on the news, and whose lives are hardly ever memorialized. And so you find out that it has everything to do with people in Gaza and focusing on them, and actually not on Israel, and focusing on people living in the slums, people living in the ghettos, people living in Haiti, people living in the Congo, people living in the slums of South Africa. This is, for me, where the focus needs to be, because this is where the solutions are. This is where the solutions have always been. So if we can close that distance, it means a huge paradigm shift to seeing things from places we actually don't like to see things, because we don't have words for them, we don't have frameworks for them. The academia was not made to listen to those stories for a certain period. We can listen to them as a case study here and there for a paper that we want to write, and so on and so forth. But we can never shift our whole intellectual production to those places. We will resist that. If we can make that shift, then I do think that we can strip the veil off the problem. But that is a challenge. That is the invitation that I make to say, it's an invitation, in an interdisciplinary invitation to apartheid studies, to see whether we can close that distance or not.
Thank you. Well, listen, let me tell you something. My motherfucking mind is blown. Like, you know, there's just we just have the most productive conversations on here, even in sort of tensions or, you know, disagreements or differences of opinion. There's just, your wheels just start turning, you know, and I just can't wait for our audience to hear this discussion. It's been amazing. I cannot wait to read all 4 volumes. Thank you so much.
I can't wait for the journal to launch and to see.
I don't know about the goddamn TikTok videos, but
no,
okay.
No. No, that really, I remember when you first started talking, you weren't talking about it as TikTok at the time, because I don't think TikTok was that big, but in general, to think about what it means to produce smaller bits of arguments that then allow people to comment at different rates, and then have a particular type of dialogue or exchange before it actually comes a fully solidified, thought out piece. Like, for me, that was really productive, to think about how do we think with each other, as opposed to the.
So no, for me.
I know you don't. I know you don't. And that's the difference. But for me,
Yeah.
I detest the idea, that classic idea of an academic that sits in a corner by themselves reading and working through ideas on their own. Like, for me, that doesn't do anything for me. And so that's why your thoughts about the way Journal of Apartheid Studies might come to be really struck me as exciting. And I'm really excited to see what that comes to be.
I like the idea of confronting reviewer number 2. I do like that. So let's see if you running that, talking all that shit in real time. That is very intriguing to me. But
yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate the platform, because every time I have a conversation and a discussion, I always grow and I always reflect. And the reason I say apartheid studies is an invitation is because I would like you guys, for instance, to test it from your own experience and say, Nyasha, this doesn't work for us. And oh, Nyasha, this is absurd. That is because you're testing from your own experiences. If I impose my reading of your world, then it is no longer a rate of oppression. It means I'm telling you how I experience oppression, and then you are supposed to use that as if that is how you live. So it is an invitation, and I'm under no illusion that everyone will agree with what I've tried to write, or that everyone will say this is the way to go. Absolutely not. What I've simply done is I've utilized my experience and observation into a framework that I would like people from anywhere to then test in their own from their own perspective and in their own experience, and then say, you know what, this is what I would like to add to this. And so it is, and the word apartheid will fall away, actually. So I'm using the word apartheid only to signal an entry point. But apartheid, like I pointed out, it's a top-down word that was used to represent how elites saw what was going on. Very soon, or at some point, apartheid studies as a framework will grow to a point where we replace the word apartheid, because the idea is that it is supposed to embody the experiences of the people experiencing what is going on, and then they name it, and then they utilize it. And so I welcome even the points of contention and the points of tension, and these are actually more important, because if I value the points of agreement more than the points of tension, it means I am making disciples here. I'm out here to make followers here. I'm out here to make, people who are going to take the word out there. No, that is, I'm looking for something that is completely the opposite. I'm not looking for disciples. I'm looking for people with an experience that I would like them to bring.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, ladies.
All right. Be safe.
Have a very
Take
good
care.
afternoon and a good evening. Good evening, Leila. Good afternoon, Dr. CBS. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Same to you.
Bye.
All right, y'all. So I'm back with another rant today because the New York Times, and by extension, the United States, has reached a new fucking low. And no, I'm not even talking about the Ukraine thing. I'm talking about this little, what is it? It's called the New York Times, The Morning. I get it in my inbox. And this is from February 20th. And essentially what they're arguing in this little piece is that the US is silencing its critique of China in order to be able to, so basically the US kind of entertainment industry is censoring itself to be able to take advantage of the Chinese market. So these goofy motherfuckers gonna say, American businesses and institutions want access to the enormous market. Given China's authoritarian leadership, that means playing by the Chinese Communist Party's rules, and in particular, avoiding criticism of its human rights abuses. So cultural institutions that are influential bastions of American values like free expression are now frequently absent from public conversations about China. First of all, this is fucking bullshit. All we see is China bashing. Anything China does, China can sneeze and they're like, ooh, see, China trying to start a war. Ooh, see, China with a new COVID variant. Like anything that China does becomes an issue for the United States. It really does not matter. It's like, ooh, hosting the Olympics. China's authoritarianism is hosting the Olympics in its country. We know that in our news media, in entertainment, in everyday conversations, it's not only China bashing that's ubiquitous, but also rampant xenophobia. And so basically what this New York Times piece is calling for is even more xenophobia, even more China bashing, even more misrepresentation of what's actually going on in the Chinese government. And they just love to throw around this authoritarianism, this autocratic label. For what reason? We know it's for accumulation. Now, the other side to this is that essentially what they've offered is a self-burn, that the United States is so fucking greedy, that these corporations and the entertainment industry is so greedy, so money hungry, that they will censor themselves, that they will go against their own values, their own traditions, their own commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of expression to get a bag. So all around, this whole piece is some bullshit, and it just represents a new low, because not only does it say that the US entertainment industry is censoring itself, but it's like, but China's making these new movies and they're anti-American, so we need to come back with our own propaganda. It's really goofy, and it just represents declining, as usual, as I always say, declining empire, imperial decadence, and the fact that the United States has no leg to stand on, and that it is increasingly intimidated by China's economic power, political influence, and from anywhere from Africa to Latin America. And that all the United States can say is like, we need to talk more shit about them to shore up our power. Goofy ass US, goofy ass New York Times. They should be ashamed of themselves. All right, y'all, before we end today, I just want to shout out a couple of important dates like we did last week. Today, the day that we're recording, is Claudia Jones's birthday, Mama Claudia Jones. So happy birthday to her. She would have been 107 years old, 221. And on 223 is my boy, Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, his birthday. He was born in 1868, so he'd have known this shit by now. I don't know, more than 150 years old. I'm not that good at math, but happy birthday to W.B. Du Bois. And then today is also the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, our shining Black prince, as they called him. And so we just want to keep all of these important dates in mind, especially as revolutionary Africans. So word
to the big bird. And and that is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown, here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Black in the Back, and we're signing off. See you next week.